March 9th, 1945. The air over the Marianas is thick with the scent of high-octane aviation fuel and the rhythmic chest-thumping thrum of 300 B-29 superfortresses. In the cockpit of the lead aircraft, the glow of the instrument panel illuminates faces etched with the exhaustion of a 3,000-mile round trip. High above the black expanse of the Pacific, a man with a cigar clenched firmly between his teeth, General Curtis LeMay, watches the horizon. He is not merely launching a raid. He is unleashing a kinetic firestorm designed to incinerate the industrial heart of an empire. Below them, Tokyo sleeps, unaware that within hours, the night sky will turn a bruised, hellish orange, and 100,000 lives will vanish in a whirlwind of flame. This is the cold, mathematical reality of total war. It is a world where victory is measured not just in miles gained, but in the systematic erasure of the enemy's capacity to resist. Behind every shattered division, every sunken fleet, and every leveled city stood a commander whose primary duty was the application of lethal force. These men were the managers of violence, tasked with navigating the most complex logistical and tactical puzzles in human history to bring about the unconditional surrender of the Axis powers. To understand the sheer scale of the carnage, one must look past the medals and the parades to the raw data of the battlefield. The following records the 5 American generals who became the most prolific instruments of destruction in the 20th century. The path to such unprecedented lethality did not begin in the cockpit of a bomber or the turret of a tank, but in the desperate strategic shifts of a world already on fire. By the dawn of 1942, the United States military found itself thrust into a conflict of staggering, almost incomprehensible proportions. The idyllic peace of the interwar years had evaporated, replaced by the grim necessity of mobilizing an entire civilization for the purpose of mechanized slaughter. The American High Command faced a dilemma that defied traditional military doctrine. They were fighting a two-ocean war against two of the most disciplined, fanatical, and technologically advanced regimes in history. In the West, the German Wehrmacht held a continent in a steel grip, utilizing movement warfare to shatter its neighbors. In the East, the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy had established a defensive perimeter across a third of the globe, anchored by a warrior ethos that viewed surrender as the ultimate disgrace. To break these powers, the United States could not rely on individual heroism alone. It required a systematic, industrial approach to lethality. The doctrine that emerged was one of total war, a concept that erased the distinction between the soldier in the trench and the factory producing his ammunition. For the American generals rising to prominence, the metric of success shifted. Victory was no longer defined by the capture of a single fortress or the winning of a symbolic duel, but by the kill ratio and the attrition rate. General George C. Marshall, the Chief of Staff, understood that to save American lives, the United States had to maximize enemy casualties through the overwhelming application of firepower. This was the American way of war, a philosophy of crushing weight, where artillery, air power, and logistics were fused into a singular machine designed to grind the enemy into the dust. The commanders selected for the most critical theaters were those who demonstrated a ruthless efficiency in this new environment. They were men who understood that the battlefield was a furnace, and their role was to keep it fed until the enemy's manpower was exhausted. In Europe, the challenge was the sheer density of German steel. Every hedgerow in Normandy and every stone village in the Rhineland was a potential killing zone. In the Pacific, the challenge was topographical and psychological. A war of island hopping where the enemy fought to the last man in caves and jungles. The American leadership had to adapt, moving away from the cautious skirmishing of the past toward a strategy of annihilation. As the draft boards filled and the shipyards of the Atlantic and Pacific coasts began churning out vessels at a rate never before seen, the blueprint for global destruction was finalized. The United States was no longer an isolated observer. It was becoming the arsenal of democracy, and its generals were the foremen of a global assembly line of fire. The strategic concerns were no longer about mere survival, but about how quickly and efficiently the Axis war machine could be dismantled piece by piece. This mobilization of resources and men set the stage for a period of unprecedented combat intensity, where the strategic decisions made in Washington and London would translate into millions of tons of ordnance dropped on distant shores. As 1943 bled into 1944, the strategic landscape shifted from desperate defense to a methodical, crushing offensive. The United States had successfully transitioned its economy into a singular engine of destruction, outproducing the entire Axis powers combined. This industrial superiority fundamentally altered the nature of command. For a general like Omar Bradley or George Patton, the availability of thousands of tanks and tens of thousands of artillery shells meant that the cost of a breakthrough was often paid in iron and cordite rather than just human waves. However, the enemy was equally committed to a war of endurance. The German army, though retreating, remained a master of defensive delay, utilizing the rugged terrain of Italy and the dense forests of the Ardennes to extract a heavy price for every yard of ground. In the Pacific, the Japanese military had transitioned to a strategy of bleeding the Americans, fortifying islands like Iwo Jima and Okinawa into subterranean fortresses where every square inch was pre-registered for mortar fire. The American High Command realized that to win, they had to increase the lethality of their operations beyond the traditional battlefield. This led to the rise of specialized commands. The development of the B-29 Superfortress and the refinement of tactical air-ground coordination meant that death could now be delivered from miles above the earth or from a screaming fighter bomber at treetop level. The strategic concern was no longer just the front line. It was the entire infrastructure of the enemy nation. To the generals in the field, the enemy was no longer just a soldier in a uniform, but a cog in a vast machine that had to be broken. This mindset necessitated a shift toward attrition-based maneuvering, moving fast to encircle large bodies of troops and then using overwhelming indirect fire to annihilate them. The scale of the forces involved was staggering. By mid-1944, General Bradley was overseeing a force larger than the entire Continental Army of the American Revolution, many times over. The logistical tale required to keep these men fed, armed, and moving was a marvel of modern engineering, but its ultimate purpose was grim: to ensure that at the point of contact, the American soldier had a 10-to-1 advantage in firepower. This was the geometry of slaughter. If a German division could be pinned against a river or a Japanese garrison, isolated on an island without supplies, the ensuing battle was not a contest, but a liquidation. This era of the war also saw the emergence of the personality commanders, men whose individual aggressive spirits became synonymous with the lethality of their units. These leaders were chosen because they refused to let the momentum stall. They understood that in a war of this magnitude, hesitation was a death sentence for their own men. By pushing their armies to the limit of human endurance, they sought to collapse the enemy's will and physical capacity to fight in one continuous bloody stroke. As the Allied pincers began to close around the Third Reich and the Japanese home islands, the stage was set for the 5 men who would oversee the most significant portion of this destruction. Their names would become legends, but their legacies would be written in the casualty reports of the defeated. To understand the lethality of the American command, one must first look at the 2 men who redefined how destruction was delivered from the land and the sky: George S. Patton, Jr. and Curtis LeMay. These 2 leaders represented the pinnacle of the American industrial war machine, though they operated in vastly different dimensions of combat. General George S. Patton, commander of the U.S. Third Army, viewed war as a fluid, violent art form. His philosophy was simple: go forward. Following the breakout from Normandy during Operation Cobra, Patton unleashed a brand of armored warfare that the Germans, the supposed masters of blitzkrieg, found impossible to contain. Patton's lethality was not found in static attrition, but in the chaos of the pursuit. Between August 1944 and May 1945, the Third Army advanced farther and faster than any other unit in Western military history. As his tanks tore through the French countryside, Patton utilized a reconnaissance in force method that bypassed enemy strongpoints to strike at the soft underbelly of German logistics. When the German 7th and 5th Panzer armies were trapped in the Falaise pocket, Patton's aggressive positioning ensured that the retreat became a massacre. By the time the Third Army reached the German border, they had accounted for over 1,400,000 enemy casualties, killed, wounded, or captured. Patton's lethality was psychological as much as physical. He broke the German soldiers' belief in his own mobility, turning every retreat into a desperate scramble for survival under the relentless fire of American 105mm howitzers and M4 Sherman tanks. While Patton broke armies on the ground, Major General Curtis LeMay was refining a method to break an entire nation from the air. In the Pacific Theater, the initial high-altitude daylight precision bombing of Japanese industry had failed due to the jet stream and the decentralized nature of Japanese manufacturing. LeMay, taking command of the 21st Bomber Command, made a cold, radical decision. He stripped the B-29s of their defensive guns, lowered their flight altitude to 5,000 feet, and loaded them with M69 incendiary clusters. The result was the most concentrated application of lethality in human history. The firebombing of Tokyo on the night of March 9, 1945, known as Operation Meeting House, remains the deadliest single air raid in history, surpassing even the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in immediate casualties. Under LeMay's direction, the U.S. Army Air Forces systematically dismantled 67 Japanese cities. His strategic air campaign claimed the lives of an estimated 330,000 to 500,000 Japanese civilians and military personnel. To LeMay, there were no innocent bystanders in a nation mobilized for total war. There were only targets. His cold calculus was that by maximizing lethality in the short term, he would force a surrender and save millions of American lives that would have been lost in a land invasion. These 2 men, one a swashbuckling cavalryman, the other a silent technician of fire, demonstrated that whether by tank or by bomber, the American path to victory was paved with the absolute neutralization of the enemy's physical presence on the map. Beyond the firestorms of Japan and the armored thrusts through France, Three other commanders orchestrated the destruction of Axis power on a scale that altered the map of the world. While LeMay and Patton focused on the sharp application of a single spearhead, Generals Douglas MacArthur, Omar Bradley, and Admiral William Halsey managed vast theaters, where the attrition of the enemy was a constant, grinding necessity. In the Southwest Pacific, General Douglas MacArthur oversaw a campaign that moved with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel, but resulted in the slow, agonizing death of the Imperial Japanese Army. MacArthur's island-hopping strategy was designed to bypass Japanese strongpoints, leaving them to wither on the vine. But the reality for those bypassed units was starvation, disease, and eventually total annihilation. In the New Guinea campaign and the liberation of the Philippines, MacArthur's forces inflicted over 400,000 casualties on the Japanese. The Battle of Manila alone saw the destruction of the city and the death of 100,000 civilians and soldiers. MacArthur's lethality lay in his ability to isolate tens of thousands of Japanese troops from their supplies, ensuring that even if they weren't killed by a bullet, they were erased as a fighting force. In Europe, General Omar Bradley commanded the 12th Army Group, the largest body of American soldiers ever to serve under a single field commander, peaking at over 1.3 million men. Bradley was the architect of the broad front strategy. While Patton provided the speed, Bradley provided the mass. His command was responsible for some of the most lethal engagements of the war, including the reduction of the Ruhr Pocket, where over 300,000 German soldiers were taken out of the war in a single stroke. Bradley's method was the methodical application of superior American artillery, the king of battle. By the end of the war, Bradley's forces had inflicted approximately 2.5 million casualties on the German Wehrmacht through a combination of relentless shelling and the overwhelming weight of American infantry divisions. Though the ranking focuses on generals, Admiral William Halsey's role as a theater commander in the Pacific makes him an essential figure in the tally of destruction. Commanding the Third Fleet, Halsey was the primary instrument of the Imperial Japanese Navy's demise. At the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history, Halsey's aggression helped break the back of Japanese naval power. His carrier-based aircraft ranged across the Pacific, sinking hundreds of thousands of tons of shipping and destroying thousands of aircraft. Halsey's philosophy was to hit hard, hit fast, and hit often. And by 1945, his fleet had effectively turned the Pacific into an American lake, having destroyed the primary defensive shield of the Japanese Empire. These 5 men did not operate in isolation. They were the collective hands on the throat of the Axis. As 1944 closed and 1945 began, their individual efforts began to converge into a singular final crescendo of violence. The scattered battles across the globe were no longer disparate events, but part of a unified terminal squeeze. The momentum generated by these commanders was now hurtling toward a definitive breaking point, where the remaining strength of the German and Japanese empires would be tested against the full, unbridled fury of the American war machine. By January 1945, the strategic patience of the American High Command had transitioned into a feverish race to end the slaughter. In Europe, the German Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, had been broken, leaving the Wehrmacht's last reserves frozen and bleeding in the snow. General Omar Bradley, coordinating the 12th Army Group, saw the opening. This was no longer a war of borders. It was a war of liquidation. Bradley's units, spearheaded by Patton's Third Army, surged toward the Rhine. The lethality of this moment was found in the closeness of the kill. American artillery, now utilizing the revolutionary proximity fuse, began exploding in the air above German foxholes, raining shrapnel downward with terrifying efficiency. At the Remagen Bridge, the 9th Armored Division's sudden seizure of a Rhine crossing opened the floodgates, allowing Bradley to funnel hundreds of thousands of troops into the German heartland. Simultaneously, in the Pacific, the scale of destruction reached a pitch that defied human imagination. While Douglas MacArthur's forces were locked in the brutal house-to-house liberation of Manila, General Curtis LeMay was finalizing the blueprints for the destruction of the Japanese home islands. The transition from precision bombing to area incendiary bombing represented the ultimate climax of American air power. On the night of March 9th, the B-29s took off from Tinian and Saipan. They flew low, their silver bellies reflecting the dark waves of the Pacific. When the first canisters of napalm and white phosphorus struck the Shitamachi district of Tokyo, the city's wooden architecture transformed into a giant furnace. The heat was so intense it created fire winds that sucked oxygen out of the lungs of those who hadn't already been consumed by the flames. The synergy of these commanders was now absolute. Bradley and Patton were erasing the German army's physical presence in the West, while MacArthur was systematically dismantling the Japanese Southern Expeditionary Army group. Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet stood offshore, a floating fortress that ensured no Japanese soldier could escape and no reinforcements could arrive. The tension of the previous years had snapped. The Axis powers were no longer fighting for victory, but for a slightly delayed annihilation. Every hour that the war continued, the tally of the dead rose by the thousands, driven by a command structure that had decided the only way to save the world was to destroy the forces that had broken it. As the Allied armies crossed the Rhine and the firestorms consumed the cities of the East, the final defenses of the Axis began to liquefy. The momentum was no longer a series of thrusts, but a singular, crushing weight. In the spring of 1945, the industrial application of death reached its zenith. In Central Europe, General Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group completed the encirclement of the Ruhr industrial area, trapping Model's Army Group B in a pocket that became a sprawling graveyard of German ambition. This was the largest surrender of an enemy force in the history of Western warfare. 317,000 men were removed from the board in a matter of weeks. As Patton's Third Army raced toward Czechoslovakia and Austria, they discovered that the German resistance had transitioned from a coherent defense into a series of frantic, lethal spasms. The kill ratio favored the Americans at staggering rates. For every GI lost, the combined weight of Patton's armor and Bradley's artillery claimed 10, 20, or 30 German lives. The Rhine was no longer a barrier, but a tomb. Across the globe, the Pacific climax was reaching an even darker resolution. Under the relentless pressure of Admiral Halsey's carrier strikes and General MacArthur's advance toward the Japanese mainland, the Imperial Japanese Navy had effectively ceased to exist. Yet, the Japanese army remained entrenched on Okinawa, where they intended to make the Americans pay for every inch of soil in blood. The American command responded with the typhoon of steel. In April and May of 1945, the sheer volume of metal fired into the Japanese positions surpassed any other engagement in the Pacific. It was here that the strategic visions of men like MacArthur and LeMay converged into a singular, devastating reality. The enemy would not surrender until their physical capacity to breathe was extinguished. The final breakthrough was not a single event, but a series of systematic collapses. In Germany, the collapse was institutional. In Japan, it was elemental. By late summer, Curtis LeMay's firebombing campaign had reduced over 60% of Japan's urban area to ash, while Halsey's fleet sat unopposed in the Tokyo Bay. The most lethal American generals had succeeded in their grim task. They had outproduced, outmaneuvered, and ultimately outkilled the most formidable adversaries the United States had ever faced. The war ended not because of a change of heart in Berlin or Tokyo, but because the men leading the American forces had rendered the continuation of the conflict a mathematical impossibility. As the smoke cleared from the charred ruins of Tokyo and the muddy fields of the Eifel, the true cost of this victory began to emerge from the shadows of the battlefield. When the guns finally fell silent in August 1945, the world looked upon a landscape transformed by the lethal efficiency of the American command. The numbers were staggering, reflecting a scale of destruction that remains difficult to fathom. In the European theater, General Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group alone had captured or neutralized over 4 million Axis soldiers. General Patton's Third Army, in its 281 days of continuous combat, had killed, wounded, or captured 1,443,888 of the enemy. These were not just statistics. They represented the total evaporation of the Wehrmacht as a fighting entity. The psychological consequence for the defeated was a state of total physical and mental collapse. German veterans later recounted the fighter bombers and the endless drum fire of Bradley's artillery as forces of nature that no amount of bravery could withstand. In the Pacific, the aftermath was even more visceral. General Douglas MacArthur's campaign had left hundreds of thousands of Japanese dead, many of whom were never recovered from the jungle floor or the pulverized bunkers of the Philippines. But it was the work of Curtis LeMay that left the most haunting scars. Strategic bombing surveys conducted after the surrender revealed that in Tokyo alone, the firebombing had destroyed 16 square miles of the city and left over 1 million people homeless. One Japanese survivor famously noted that the B-29s did not feel like weapons of war, but like the finger of God erasing existence. The strategic consequence was clear. The American generals had proven that a modern industrial power could not only defeat an enemy, but physically dismantle its civilization from afar. The human cost, however, extended beyond the enemy. The men who led these campaigns carried the weight of their decisions. Bradley, known as the soldiers' general, was haunted by the casualties sustained during the Huertgen forest, a meat grinder that many argued was unnecessary. Patton, despite his bravado, spent his final days in a restless state of agitation, perhaps sensing that the violent world he mastered had no place for him in the coming peace. They had become the most lethal men in history, but the cost of that lethality was a burden that would define the rest of their lives and the collective memory of the nations they served. As the dust settled, the focus shifted from the immediate carnage to the permanent changes these men had wrought upon the global order. The influence of these 5 commanders extended far beyond the immediate surrender of the Axis powers. They fundamentally altered the DNA of global military doctrine. The sheer lethality achieved by LeMay and Halsey signaled the end of the era of protected interiors. No longer could a nation rely on its geography to shield its population or its industry. The LeMay doctrine of massive preemptive strategic bombing became the cornerstone of the Cold War's strategic air command, establishing the terrifying logic of mutually assured destruction. The world had learned that in the hands of a determined command, the air itself could be turned into a weapon of total erasure. In the sphere of land warfare, the broad front strategy of Omar Bradley and the rapid, decentralized pursuit, perfected by George Patton, became the blueprints for modern maneuver warfare. The U.S. Army emerged from the conflict not just as a victor, but as a master of logistical lethality, the ability to move massive amounts of fire and steel across oceans and continents with pinpoint timing. This American way of war emphasized the preservation of one's own manpower through the absolute saturation of the enemy's position with indirect fire. It was a shift toward capital-intensive warfare, where the casualty count of the enemy was directly proportional to the tonnage of supplies delivered to the front. Diplomatically, the scale of the destruction managed by these generals created a new stark reality for the post-war world. The total collapse of the German and Japanese military structures left a vacuum that only the United States and the Soviet Union could fill. The lethality of the American campaign had been so thorough that it necessitated a complete rebuilding of the defeated nations, a transition from annihilation to administration. General MacArthur's shift from the liberator of the Philippines to the proconsul of Japan illustrated this perfectly. The man who had overseen the destruction of the Japanese Empire was now tasked with ensuring it could never rise as a military power again. This era of total war had proven that under the pressure of survival, human ingenuity in the art of killing knew no bounds. The tools and tactics developed by these 5 men remained the standard by which all subsequent conflicts would be measured, casting a long, somber shadow over the second half of the 20th century. The weapons had been holstered, and the maps had been redrawn, but the fundamental question remained: what did this era of unprecedented slaughter reveal about the nature of the men who led it? To look upon the records of Bradley, Patton, MacArthur, LeMay, and Halsey is to look into the heart of a paradox. These 5 men were not monsters. They were the refined products of a democratic society pushed to the brink of extinction. They were engineers, scholars, and aviators who were asked to solve the most horrific math problem in history: how to end a global conflagration by fueling it with more fire than the enemy could endure. Their lethality was born of a grim necessity, the belief that a slow war was a more cruel war, and that the only path to a lasting peace lay through the absolute, uncompromising destruction of the machines and men that served tyranny. Yet, the legacy of these commanders serves as a stark reminder of the cost of such a philosophy. The hundreds of thousands of lives taken under their orders, whether in the burning streets of Tokyo or the frozen forests of the Ardennes, form a silent assembly that stands behind every tactical victory and every territorial gain. Their careers reveal that leadership in the crucible of total war is not merely about bravery or charisma. It is about the capacity to bear the psychological weight of being an instrument of fate. They moved divisions like pieces on a board, but the pieces were human lives, and the board was the scorched earth of 3 continents. In the end, the ranking of these generals by enemy casualties is more than a study in military statistics. It is an exploration of the terrifying heights of human capability. It shows us that when a nation's survival is at stake, it will produce leaders who can master the mechanics of death with the same precision that a clockmaker masters time. We remember them not because they loved war, but because they were the ones capable of finishing it. Their story remains a somber testament to the fact that while peace is a triumph of the spirit, it is often secured by those willing to walk through the fire and command the storm.